APIs are the bread and butter of software. They are probably the most used component of software engineering. APIs are ways for two different softwares to talk to each other. Just like you and I communicate through English, right? If you want something from me, you ask me using English, using a certain protocol. You have to format it in a way of a question. You have to use words. You have to use verbs, right? There is a protocol, but the language is English, and you use English to ask me for information, and I use English to give you information. And when you have two different softwares and one software needs information from the other software, it uses API to ask for it. Okay, I'm going to show you some real examples coming up. So as testers, when you are becoming QA automation engineer or software engineer in test, one of the major things you do is testing APIs, testing that communication is working correctly. For any application to work correctly, it has to be able to fetch data correctly and it has to be able to send data correctly. So API testing is a non-negotiable part of software engineering or software testing. So you are becoming a software engineer in test, SDET or QA automation engineer. And I've created an 8-step process to become that, and API testing is one of the major ones, and I put it at step 5. Now, once you finish API testing, technically you are a QA automation engineer, but you're not an SDET yet. There are more things, there are more engineering type of things like CI/CD, Docker, things like that will make you a software engineer in test and SDET. But absolutely, you are going to be an automation engineer if you know how to automate the front end, which is step 3, and automate the back end, which is this step 5. Okay, so in this video, we're just going to talk more about that. I want to give you a little bit more context about APIs, how they work, what they look like. So when we say we're going to test APIs, so you know what that means. So here, this simple schematic shows you we have a front end that's talking to the back end, and the back end is talking to the database. Now, with the database, it's not the back end in the database where the back end is being like some kind of code. It's not using APIs to talk to the database, but the front end is the stuff that we see. Right? It looks great. It's formatted in a way that we want it. We can understand it. We can use it. But the brain, all the decision making happens on a server somewhere. So the front end gets that information from the server using an API call. They say you go to an e-commerce site and you have products. You go to Amazon and you have products on the page, right? Or you search for something. You go and search for a laptop, and all of a sudden you see a bunch of laptops. But the search you did is in the front end, in the graphical user interface, which is on your browser, on your local machine. But what happened when you search is it actually made a request to the server, to Amazon server, saying, hey, the user wants this. They made an API request, and the backend returned back or responded with some data, and the front end formatted it and displayed it in a way that is designed to display. So the information was requested from the backend and sent back. When you log in, the same thing. You click log in, you're going to make an API call to say, hey, is this user legit? And then the backend figures that out, goes to the database, checks everything, makes sure the user is legit, and responds back, right? Those are keywords, the request and the response. That's how APIs work. Responds back saying, hey, the user is good to go, and here is the data to show the user. And the front end will basically display whatever is supposed to be displayed. So that's how two softwares talk to each other, including external software. So to make it even more clear, I'm going to give you some examples. You might have seen this slide from a short video or something like that. So let's say you are building a product that needs a map. You're building something like Uber, or you're building something like Zillow, right? Zillow needs the business of like selling houses, renting houses, and things like that. They're not in a business of building apps, correct? When you look at Uber, Uber is in a business of connecting two people, one driver, one passenger. They're in the business of connecting those two people, charging money, and offering transportation. They're not in the business of building a map, right? So when you want to build a business like that, are you going to invest all the time and energy required to build a map? Are you going to deploy satellites or go and scan the entire world, all the roads, and build a map? Probably not. You're going to find somebody that has done that so you can use their product. In this case, Google Map, right? We know Google Maps is awesome. They have mapped out pretty much the entire world, and you want to use their map. And how you're going to do that is Google Map, when they build that application, just like anybody that builds an application, they exposed, that's also it's a technical term, they exposed the API. So other people can use the API. So you're going to pay Google to use the API. That's one of the ways they make their money, right? So you're going to make an API call to Google Maps API, and you're going to get a response. You might ask her like, hey, give me a map of Vegas. Give me a map of this little area. I mean, the API is a little bit more complicated because it's moving all the time. It's changing all the time. But your app is going to make an API call to Google Map and then get information about the map. You might need some kind of data about that city, right? Let's say the population data or the weather or something. Then you make another API call to another software that somebody else built. So you're going to get information from that. So your application is basically orchestrating those a bunch of API calls. Somebody figured out how to do something, somebody else figured out how to do something, and you want to use those functionalities. You don't have to build that. You don't have to build it from scratch. You're going to use API to talk to them. These people figure out how to do something, so you're going to go, hey, give me this information, give me this information, give me that information. So one application is going to talk to a bunch of applications using APIs, collect the information. So when you're testing it, the way you're testing it is if you're building this application, you're testing it, hey, am I making the API correctly? If the API sends me this kind of response, am I handling it correctly? If the API gives me a bad response, am I handling it correctly? If you are the person working for the API, let's say you're working for Google Maps, you're testing the API, then your job is, if somebody asks for this information, are we providing that information correctly? If somebody asks for this information in a bad way, are we responding the right way? Are we telling them what they did wrong? Are we telling them how to fix it? Or are we just blowing up? How is the API handling it? When they send us some information, do we send them the right thing? Do we do the right thing in the database? When you send that information saying, hey, create a user, am I creating the user in the database? I'm going to show you that. That's one example. Another similar example would be like payment processing, right? You want to build an app. Let's say you want to sell shoes. You want to build an app. When I say an app, it could be a mobile app, it could be a web app. Most of the time, I'm thinking of web applications, right? Because a lot of times we test web applications, websites. Those are web applications. So you're building a website, an e-commerce website where you want to sell shoes. You're not in the business of working with banks, figuring out credit card laws and the government and all of that stuff. You're not, right? You just want to collect money and you just want to sell shoes. Your expertise are shoes, sneakers. So what you're going to do is you're going to integrate with somebody that knows how to handle money, like PayPal or Stripe. So you're going to integrate with them using their API. So PayPal created this product that they figured out how to deal with money, how to deal with credit card, how to deal with the government regulations, everything. They figured all that out. That's their business. So they build a software that handles that, and they expose an API. Somebody that wants to, deal with payments, they just talk to them. Right? They use the API to talk to them. So you say, hey, Bob just came. This is their credit card information. Are they legit? Can you charge them? And PayPal is going to be like, I know how to do this. I know how to take a credit card and make it happen. And PayPal will figure that out and be telling, yep, I got the money from Bob. Put it in your account. And you're going to send them their shoe. So you don't have to deal with that. You focus on building the shoes business instead of the banking business, right? So you use API to talk to other companies or other products. Hopefully that made sense. All right. I'm going to show you an example of what an actual API looks like. So when you go back to our slides, a typical API would look like this, right? You would have a curl is basically, it's a tool to make an API call when you're doing it from the command line, from the terminal. But what you need to know, there will normally be a URL where the API is going to, right? The product, Google. This would be https://google.com/map, blah, blah. Then there's a bunch of information. This could get really complicated, but normally you would have some kind of data, right? So you can just take a screenshot of this if just as a reminder, but download the PDF. I'll talk about that later on. Let's look at a real example of an API for our e-com site. So let's say we have this e-commerce site and you go to my account and you can fill in the information and register. That is registering a user using the front end, right? There is an API. When I put in the email here and the password here, when I click on register, that information is sent over to the database using an API. So as API tester, you're going to make that call directly without dealing with the front end. So there is a tool called Postman. Okay, Postman is one of the most popular tools for APIs. It can be used for API automation, but I don't recommend it. Like for simple cases, it's perfect. But for more complicated things, you need a real framework like PyTest, Python, Java. You need a real framework. That is at least my feeling around that. So let's look at this API here. Let me see if I can make it bigger. So we have the URL is saved in a variable, but you can see that when I hover over it, you can see it is going to that website, dev.bootcamp.store. Then there is a specific resource. This is customers. And when you look at the payload, so the payload is the data you send with the API call. Let's say I'm going to create this user, test user 50, right? I'm going to give it this password and hit send. Now this basically gave me a 201 response, right? I made a request and I got a response. The request is saying, hey, create this user. And the response is saying, hey, I was successful, was created. And these are the information about the user. Like it has the email that I gave it and it filled in a bunch of default values like shipping address, billing address, all of that is empty because I'd never sent it. Now, as a tester, my job is, okay, first of all, I made the call, I got the response. Did I get the right response? Sure. I'm going to look at this. First, I'll look at the status code, 201. That's good code. Then I look at the body. You don't just stop there. You look at the body of the response body and you say, oh, I got the right things or not. Then in addition to that, you go to the database and you make sure it is there. We saw that in the SQL video, right? The video right previous to this. So if I take this user, then I'll go to my database and I'm going to run a query in that same table, actually, right? The users table. And I go put in my email address for the new user I created. I execute it. I basically use a shortcut on my keyboard to execute, but I could have just clicked here. Now I see the user in the database. Now I can say my test passed after I verify everything in the database is correct. And I might need to verify multiple tables. So in automation, that's what your automation is doing. Your automation is going to say, you're going to prepare some data, you're going to make an API call, you're going to get the response and verify the response looks good. In addition to that, it could go to the database and make sure that user is in the database. Or instead of going to the database, it can make another API call that says, fetch me the user, right? There's an API call that says create user. There's another API call that says get user, create user, get user. So you're going to make a create user, then we're going to say get user to make sure the user was actually created. So those are hands-on examples. They might be a little complicated because you've never done APIs. If you've never done APIs, everything I just talked about might be like, whoa, what is that? But those are like really simple once you get into it. And it's really not negotiable. You cannot be an automation engineer without learning APIs. So like I said, this should be your step 5. You learn the programming language, you learn the fundamentals, just terminology and stuff. You learn web automation tools. This is a counterpart, right? We're talking about backend testing right now and first front-end testing. And then you learn SQL. The thing is, backend testing is so much easier. So much easier. Initially, front-end testing is going to seem like it's easier because we all used to using website. We can see it with our own eyes, so we can test it and it makes sense. But later on, once you start doing backend testing, oh, you're going to love it. I personally do love it because front-end is flaky or the browser is slow and this, click that. Backend, man, it's all like super fast and you get it right one time. It's always going to be right. It's not flaky like the front end. Trust me, initially it's intimidating because it's all code, but later on, backend is going to be your favorite. I promise you that. All right. So not much to talk about here. The UI testing versus backend testing. We literally spent the whole time talking about that. UI is when you have the front end, the actual application loaded, whether it's a phone or a browser, when you go and click and use it as a user. And API testing is there's no screen, right? You're going directly to the database. We were talking to the service, the actual application, the backend of the application using the API. You're going to talk to the API. Normally you talk to the front end talks to the backend using API. That's how the user would use it. But now you're just going to skip the UI and you go to the backend. So like I said earlier, API testing is non-negotiable. You got to do it. It's a full thing. It is easier and more stable than UI testing. Initially, that might be a little intimidating, but later on, I guarantee you're going to like backend testing. Also, the job market is much more for backend testing. That's something I did not mention before, but every website has some kind of backend. But every backend does not have a website, okay? One website might have a super complicated backend. Just think about this AI applications. In the back, there's a lot of information going around, a lot of stuff happening, but there's just one UI. For the front-end tester, you're testing that one UI, but the back-end tester is testing so many things to support that one feature, that one application. So there's way more jobs that want you to know how to do back-end testing. So knowing back-end testing, again, another reason for it to not be negotiable. You make sure you do that. The next thing is when you're looking for courses, this is my personal opinion, of course. A lot of courses would say back-end testing automation, API automation, and they show you Postman or Rest Assured, right? Those are like specialized programs. Postman is what I just talked about. That is good, but it's not good enough. Okay, you need to know how to do the backend testing using a programming language and a proper framework, a testing framework, because you are going to be a tester. Again, where to start learning? The first place, if I were you, is I'll definitely check out my course. It's a totally free course. I call it Software Testing Fundamentals. The link is in the description to start there. There is over 4 hours of content related directly to API testing. So there is 2 big sections. There is SQL and API. Those are big sections, technical sections. Pretty much gets you everything you need to get started. It's not automation though. It just gets you started with API testing API, setting it up, practicing with different APIs, doing stuff what I just did in a slower manner, of course. So you're going to learn how to use APIs and later on you're going to learn how to automate them. Because that course is manual course. It's not coding involved. So it's a good place to start. I definitely recommend that. Other than that, like I always say, Udemy is a great resource. Check if your library has free access. I live here in Vegas and my library has free access to Udemy. So it's pretty awesome. I can take any Udemy course. Whenever I want to do research, I actually do that. So check that out. If not, if you just buy your own course, it's hit or miss, right? So Udemy is like just a pool of everything. There's good and bad. So do your research. YouTube is great for that, something like this, something that's small, but it's too much distraction. So for somebody that's serious, can't just sit there on YouTube and learn. It's a really good place to start, but you need more professional environment to learn. So check out my stuff. Other than that, hopefully you already downloaded this guide. The link is down in the description. You can go to the website, look at the page, download the PDF, and have this as a reference. If you just go through this 8 steps, check, you literally are going to be ready for a very competitive SDET position. You are going to be very competitive. So make sure you do the work. But if you do want to work with me, I do offer one-on-one coaching, like I mentioned several times in my previous videos, that you can just work with me one-on-one. I can hold your hand and give you projects, guide you through the whole process, and become a QA automation engineer or software engineer in test. If you want to do the self-paced route, check that out. Also, I have a community in 1 month free. The whole month is free right now. At least check out. You can take a couple of courses and see how it goes and just become a QA automation engineer on your own speed. Still a community. You can still ask questions. Hopefully, I'll see you there. If you have any questions, send me a message, put a comment, and like this video. Make sure people know that this video exists. If you like it, algorithm will show it to others. And go ahead and watch the next one. It will show up somewhere on the screen, right here or right here. And check out step number 6 in your QA automation journey.